Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. A senior United Nations official told the Security Council last week that the climate emergency generated by global warming is exacerbating existing risks to international peace and security, while also creating new ones. While the research regarding the link between peace, security, and climate change is still ongoing, experts are pushing for world leaders to take notice of how the environment will impact efforts to maintain peace. Let's discuss this further today with our guests. Joining us for this conversation is Mr. Sven, who's a former United Nations Director and Director of Klima 2020. He joins us from Oslo. Also joining us today is Mr. Kaunert, who's a Professor of Policing and Security and Director of the International Centre of Policing and Security at the University of South Wales. He joins us from Cardiff. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Sven, let me begin with you. Now, the link between, as I said, security, peace, and climate change is still one that is requiring a lot of research, a lot of groundwork. But there are links that have been drawn already. How much do we know about the relationship between the two?
I think we know quite a lot. And we know that climate change will have a very severe impact on millions of people, and this is increasing. And when we have a problem, we have two ways of solving the problem. One way is to cooperate to solve it, and another way is to fight. And as we look into the consequences of climate change, it looks like there might be a lot of fighting and too little cooperation, as of course the UN is encouraging. But to say something about the obvious links between climate change and conflicts is that there will be less food, less water, there will be refugees, there will be extreme weather and so forth. And all these impacts from not less sea level rise, and all these impacts from climate change that creates these problems have the potential to create a lot of fighting, actually. We even today know that maybe the Arabic Spring and what is happening in Syria,
right.
It's not a main cause, but climate change has had an impact and contribution to these problems.
Right. On that point, Mr. Tveitdal, I'm going to come back to some of the things you mentioned here. But before that, I'm going to jump to Mr. Kaunert and talk to him about this. Mr. Kaunert, in the framework of security, how much are these environmental factors now being considered?
It used to be the case that security was all about, geopolitics was all about different countries fighting one another in war. But since the 1990s, we've seen increasingly that academic scholars and practitioners have seen that, in fact, our security agenda has broadened. And climate security is, in fact, one of those very important issues on the security agenda because it has a lot of impact in terms of traditional security. So like the previous speaker was saying, it has an impact on territory, it has an impact on food, it has an impact on a number of security issues that really concern people, and therefore it has an impact on pre-existing conflicts. It can exacerbate them, it can make them more difficult to actually solve, and therefore it has a very clear impact. But it also has an impact on what you might call soft security issues. It has an impact on things that didn't used to be seen as security issues, but increasingly are, such as refugees. The climate change is have an impact in the sense that a number of people are going to be stateless. A number of people are not going to have homes, and therefore they're going to invariably become refugees. As a result of that, this is going to create security issues for those countries where those people will arrive, whether that is cultural issues, whether that is competition for resources, or whether that is just, being able to share the resources, having to share the resources that those countries have. And that will therefore create security issues. Increasingly, in academia, we're seeing that people take this very, very seriously, and climate security is one of the top issues on the agenda.
Right. Mr. Kaunert, as you say, in academia, this seems to be taken very, very seriously. But my question is that it seems like it's not translated when we talk about security issues across the world in mainstream media, in many of other channels, on many other platforms, especially as Mr. Tveitdal talked about how we can frame the Syrian war in terms of it actually being sparked by a drought, being linked to climate change right then and there. Why do you think that there's still that hindrance to actually come about and bring climate change at the center of these discussions?
Yes, I think it is very difficult, of course, to grasp for normal people that don't necessarily read all the articles and books that academics have to read all the time. I think the correlation that we have witnessed so far is very clearly there. But for a lot of people, it is something that they don't see in their everyday life. And like you've said, it had an impact on the conflict in Syria. Very clearly, there's been a correlation between rising temperatures, between shortages of food, between, therefore, human propensity towards violence. I mean, we have seen those kind of studies that clearly indicate that it has an impact on actual war. But of course, for those people who are fighting the war, for those who are actually inside the conflict, for them it seems like an indirect effect that they don't actually witness with their own eyes, even though as academics we can study that and we can see the correlation, we can look at the statistical models and we can actually find that causality that is inherent in those security threats. For individuals, it is more difficult to see, and as a result of that, it hasn't had the impact. But I think it is something that we need to talk about more, that we need to explain to people how those correlations happen and how it has an impact on their everyday life.
Right, I'm going to come back to you, and we're going to try to discuss how that information can be translated in the way we're trying to discuss and frame it today, how it can come to a manner in which individuals see climate change as not just one of the sidelined issues, but something that will, in fact, directly impact peace and security. Mr. Sven Tveitdal, while we're on the point of countries being destabilized by these climate change factors being one of the reasons why conflict is triggered, which regions do you see conflict erupting more and more in the coming years because of climate change?
I think we will see this more or less all over the world, but the result will be different. In my view, the most dangerous area is Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. Because if you look into what is happening with the population development, in Africa today, they have a little bit more than 1 billion people. But according to UN and other reports, this might increase to between 3 and 4 billion by the end of the century. And when you on top of that have so many people that needs more food and have climate change that will reduce actually crop and food production as well as water, then you have something that you have an equation that doesn't work. So definitively Africa is a hotspot. And of course, we all already see it in the refugees that are coming to Europe. And we are not very clever we don't want them, but if we don't want them as refugees, we have to help them where they are. And we are not very good at doing that, and this conflict will only escalate. But you have other regions, you have, and then you have some hotspots. Another one in Africa is around like Chad, where actually what happens with climate change is fodder for extremism like Boko Haram.
Right.
And you see it also in the Horn of Africa and in the Middle East. So that's examples.
Mr. Tveitdal, you state these examples. I want to take this question to Mr. Christian Kaunert and ask him, when we look at conflicts across the world, how many of them have a basis or have root causes that are linked to natural resources? I mean, how much potential is there when it comes to natural resources for conflicts to be sparked?
I mean, pretty much all of the conflicts have a natural resource dimension. Not all of them are necessarily rooted in a conflict about natural resources, but there is an element about natural resources in very, very pretty much the majority of those conflicts. They're also linked to other issues like ethnic identity, kind of historical relations, and so on. But that material dimension is there. And of course, with climate change, it changes the equation for the material dimension. It makes the material dimension, in a sense, more sought after, that the different parties to a particular conflict are going to be in even fiercer competition for that material dimension. And because of that, we're going to see increasing problems. Because of that, most conflicts that we see around the world that we already have in existence right now are going to be accelerated. The conflict is going to be made worse by climate change, and it's going to make it much more difficult actually to solve the conflicts as we see them right now. I mean, if you just wanted to look at areas that are very close to your TV viewers, of course, Pakistan is going to be one of those countries that is going to be very affected by climate change. And as a result of that, this can make the whole regional security much, much more difficult.
Mr. Christian Kaunert, now when we are talking about resources becoming more scarce and that leading to greater conflict, there is another theory on the back end of this, which talks about the resource curse, which means that too many resources for a country can also lead to greater conflict. Can you expand on that a little more for us?
Yes, I mean, primarily this has been seen with oil and gas, that we see that in a sense, because societies become dependent on oil and gas, we see networks of patronage, we see, in a sense, the stabilization of bad governance. And because we see the stabilization of bad governance, what we then also see is that we don't see the kind of entrepreneurial, innovative mindset that is needed in order to really take advantage. Now, it isn't necessarily the case that oil and gas, for instance, has to lead to negative implications, but the way it's been done in a lot of countries, and you see that most recently, for instance, with Venezuela and the trouble that is there with oil and gas there, but you see that also in other contexts. You see that in Africa, you see that in the Middle East, in Nigeria, although you see some good examples. I mean, Norway, for instance, is one of those countries that has set aside a specific fund that is derived from oil and gas, and as a result of that is able to then support the rest of the economy. So it's not necessarily something that has to happen, but in those cases where it does happen, and it's quite large chunks of the world where this does happen, it actually can lead to bad governance and therefore security issues.
Mr. Sven Tveitdal, now as we talk about conflict, it's also important to understand how the environment can create and foster peace. Now, when we talk about ecological interdependency between nations, how certain resources can in fact promote peace, promote cooperation, do you see that happening in the world?
Well, it's too little. It is, of course, important today also to talk about the corona pandemic, because in this case the world has managed to raise enormous resources to try to solve the problem which is just in front of us. And I think the most important thing today is the policy related to recovery and all these trillions of dollars that are used. Because if they are not used to also think about how we can prevent climate change and global warming in the future, then, and if we are going back to business as usual, we have lost a fantastic opportunity. But unfortunately, the capability for politicians in the world, for the UN, to raise resources against global warming and climate change is not very high. And this is this biggest challenge we have in the future, because climate change is a much worse threat to us than the coronavirus, and it will not end. So, I think the reason why we are have so big problems about mobilizing resources is not that they are not there, which we see now they are for the corona, but we are not able to take a consequence of something the scientists say is coming in a few decades, but it's not there just now.
Mr. Sven, I was reading somewhere that one of the good things about the pandemic here, and when we especially talk about how it's going to impact climate change policies, is that it has allowed to once again give the experts the rightful platform to voice their concerns. For a very long time, as you say, the work done by scientists was being undermined all across the world, but this allowed an opportunity for experts to be front and center. Do you see it that way?
We have been fighting for that for 30 years, that the experts should, in a way, have the right impact on policy. And it has not worked so far. Of course, that we see now that we are able to fight the coronavirus, and also that now people all over the world is feeling a crisis, and for the future they don't want to have another crisis. So that might help in a way rising the awareness and understanding that we have to do something fast and very, very serious to resist and hinder global warming. So I am a little bit optimistic on the impact from the pandemic, but I sincerely hope that we are not wasting all these recovery resources without have two thoughts in the head at one time and use it for reducing risk for climate change. And now it doesn't happen the way it should. There is now trillions and trillions of money that are poured after the fossil energy firms, oil and gas firms, which should not have happened now. It should have gone into mobilizing renewable energy projects and save work that way. We have the same discussion going on in Norway very much.
Those points are duly noted, and they're important points to note that while a lot of people were optimistic that the policies and decisions that would be taken now during the pandemic would go towards green recovery, we're not really exactly seeing that happen all across the world. Mr. Christian Kaunert, going back to a point you mentioned, which was soft issues and how refugees are seen as soft issues. We know that in the future, climate migration will increase considerably into the millions. Now, what the pandemic has revealed is the importance of pre-planning. Countries, there seem to still be in denial that they will not have to face this refugee crisis, this climate refugee crisis, as we call it. How do you think they should be preparing for it?
I think you're absolutely right in saying that right across the world we see if there isn't sufficient crisis planning in advance, it's very, very difficult to get things right when the crisis hits, because you have very little time, you have very little opportunities to really implement the policies properly. So as a result of that, you need to really prepare for this. The trouble that we have when we talk about climate security and also then about climate refugees is that it is not something immediate, but it's something medium term. And what we find, like psychologists have this effect, they've studied this effect, that there's a certain optimism bias in all crises. Now, when we have the combination of a medium-term crisis, but very severe crisis, coupled with a certain optimism bias, we see that politicians on the whole, they tend to ignore this crisis. They don't want to prepare. We've seen this also with Covid-19. A lot of countries, even though this was to an extent foreseeable, not the precise virus necessarily, but that there could be a kind of pandemic where we have a virus that is transmitted from human to human, that was foreseeable. Nonetheless, politicians did not always prepare very well for this crisis. And when we have a medium-term crisis,
Professor Christian Kaunert, I want to interject here since we're all short on time, and what you raise here is a very important point, which is the optimism causing a lack of momentum to deal for an impending crisis. But when we talk about the refugee migrant crisis, I'm not just talking about denial here of whether or not it's going to happen, but the aggressive attitude that goes against accepting refugees, which we're seeing sweep all across the world. When we're talking about a world in which so many individuals will be living in places that are hot zones, they will have to move. How should countries be preparing in terms of attitude and actually setting down policies which are favorable for migration?
The only way that you can prepare for a crisis like that is by cooperation, because what we saw very clearly in the 2015 refugee crisis in Europe was that Europe as a whole took in a very significant number of refugees. But because of the bad planning, because of not having the structures in place in terms of receiving them, it became all a little bit chaotic. And we saw that in particular with regards to Germany, but also with the Scandinavian countries and so on. So what we need to do is to put the institutional mechanisms in place at the global level, but also at the regional level, where we actually find the instruments, where we develop the legal instruments, where we develop the policy tools that allow us to deal with the challenges that come, because the challenges are going to happen over the next decades. And at the moment, the world is not prepared. We don't have the mechanisms in place. Right. Beyond Europe, we barely can speak about a refugee regime. Many countries outside Europe don't even have concrete policies for that. So in that sense, it's very, very urgent that the world deals with that.
Right. And just to drill the point, Mr. Sven Tveitdal, how massive is this migration, is this refugee crisis to be if we don't take a hold on emissions right now, if we don't meet the targets that were set out?
I think it is, we are talking about tens and hundreds of millions. And I don't think you can build walls or you can try to prevent. And I don't think we can build walls that are high enough to solve this problem. It is one of the biggest that we will have in the future. Let me mention that there is one thing that is good with having the security issue on the agenda when it comes to climate change. And that is, of course, that for the last 30 years, it has been the environmentalists that has been the really eager people to try to fight climate change, and they have never been very strong. The security people, they are stronger. So the more and more they understand about the security issue related to climate change, I think the easier it will be to have world leaders in a way trying to mobilize resources to prevent it. So that is a positive thing on having security on the agenda.
Right, that it is a very strong point and an important point to remember. As the security element in the climate change debate becomes stronger, it might also create greater momentum for leaders across the world to take more strict actions that are needed in order to tackle this crisis that we're seeing unfold in front of us. Thank you so much, Mr. Sven Tveitdal, for joining us from Oslo, Mr. Kaunert for joining us from Cardiff. We're going to go for a short break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about climate change policies and how they're being impacted by the ongoing pandemic. Stay with us. Welcome back. The pandemic that has caused more than 16 million infection cases as of today has been strongly put side by side with climate change. We've discussed on the show before the many ways in which the COVID-19 outbreak relates to the changes in climate and environmental degradation. Today, we will discuss how COVID-19 has impacted climate change policies and how keeping in light the events that the pandemic made us witness globally. What can we learn to strategize to deal with the climate crisis better? Joining us for this conversation today is Mr. Sven Hermling, who's a global policy lead at the CARE International Foundation. He joins us from Bonn. Also joining us today is Professor Srinivas, who's a professor of global environmental policy at the Kwansei Gakuin University in Japan. He joins us from Japan. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Sven Hermling, now to begin this discussion and talking about how right now in a pandemic that we've seen unfold in front of our eyes for about 7 months now, talking about the impact it has had on climate change discussions and policies, where do you see us standing right now?
Yeah, I think first I need to highlight the big tragedy that we see in many countries because of the impact of the COVID crisis, with many people still suffering. And in some countries, numbers rising again. I think that's very concerning. And also, in a lot of countries, like in African countries, for example, there's often not sufficient global media attention that this has real impact. But I think what we've seen in the last couple of months in terms of the linked debate to climate change is quite relevant. On the one hand, we've seen a number of countries which have been impacted by so-called compound risks, that while at the same time, while they were fighting COVID, and this put severe stress on many people and institutions, climate change impacts were threatening them and hitting them, whether it was like hurricanes, for example, or cyclones in Bangladesh, where many people suffered. At the same time, we've also seen that there's absolute need to find cleaner ways of development which make societies more resilient and which don't run us more deeply into the trouble of the climate crisis. And I think one of the positive developments has been that many institutions globally in some countries have managed to really understand, okay, we need to, for example, when we start investing into recovery measures, we need to do it in a way that it doesn't drive us deeper into the climate crisis.
Right. That's an important point, and I'll take this to Professor Srinivas. Professor, do you feel like this effort to now move towards a green recovery plan is earnestly being adopted all across the world, and especially when we focus on parts in Asia?
Absolutely. I think what we are actually seeing is the possibilities of action we can take on climate change. As you probably know by now, there has been almost a 6% drop in global emissions in CO2 as a result of COVID-19, which is as a result of the lockdown, decrease in industrial capacities, reduction in transportation, etc. That is a significant drop in emissions, even though, of course, what we really need is about 7.6% reduction in CO2 emissions. Still, what it essentially does, because what COVID has done, is actually show us the possibilities of the capacities that human societies have to actually reduce CO2 emissions.
Professor Srinivas, but this wasn't an intentional effort to go out and reduce emissions. It was a consequence of this pandemic. And when we talk about aggressive recovery of economies, which will be needed, it seems like this on the docket, green recovery for many developed parts of the world, seems like a far-off dream.
Absolutely. No. What I was trying to get at essentially is this need for lifestyle change, green recovery strategies that target lifestyle changes, because that's exactly the starting point for any kind of recovery, and any kind of recovery that targets climate change in the end. So if you're looking at not using cars, for example, that results in lack of pollution, that calls eventually for a lifestyle change in our values, in the way we use resources. Ultimately, that is what will bring down the negative effects of climate change, or at least reduce the impacts. And what COVID has essentially shown us is how far we can go in terms of lifestyle change. Not only to target COVID itself in the short term, but even, if possible, climate change itself in the long term. So any green recovery plan is not just an economic recovery from COVID-19, but it goes further. It has to go further beyond to include lifestyle changes in the way we live, in the way we use resources, in the energy we use, the waste we produce. All this, we have seen the impacts as a result of COVID, but now we have to go beyond that and try to see how lifestyle changes can bring about reduction in the risk of climate change.
Right. Mr. Sven Hermling, to this point that Professor Srinivas makes, that we've seen that lifestyle changes have worked in order to tackle the pandemic, and we're hoping that it will be a strategy that's adopted by many countries to also tackle climate change. Now, the issue with this is that when we see the pandemic, we have been enumerating the impact of it all over, especially in terms of the unfortunate death tolls, and they have been rising, being impacted daily by the policies adopted by countries. When we see the climate crisis, we don't see those immediate consequences. Therefore, the momentum to actually take those actions seems not to be on the horizons. It seems like a far-off possibility. Do you think that has changed when we put in focus that pandemics like these will become more frequent in the future?
I think among many people, there's a, let's say, steep learning curve over the last months, and there's an increased not only awareness, but also tolerance, I would say, to accept let's say, certain types of drastic measures if people on the streets understand, yeah, this is necessary to confront this crisis. And that's why I think in many countries there has been overall support for the measures that have been taken. Of course, there are we need to look into details. Some countries have taken steps towards, let's say, autocratic systems, which is, of course, not where we should go to. But generally, a lot of acceptance for such measures. And I understand from many conversations that I've also had is that people more and more understand that climate change is there now. It's not a long-term threat, and unless we act now, it will drive us so much into deep trouble, and many people are seeing this and experiencing this today. So I think there's an increased awareness and even maybe impatience with policymakers to take the steps that are necessary to drive the transformation we need into clean energy, renewable energies, away from fossil fuels, which often also pollute the environment and the air, which brings negative health aspects, but also to make countries, communities more resilient to the impacts of climate change, being better adapted. And in our work as CARE, we've seen in many developing countries, poor countries, how important it is, for example, to invest particularly into women-led initiative, which promote gender equality, which strengthen women's roles and leadership in health systems, etc. And there's a lot of potential to combine this with climate confronting measures, so to say. So I think there is a lot of potential now to drive further the shift in a way that is supporting poor and vulnerable people, and it is not, if it's perceived as just another measure of driving inequality, and where only, for example, the poor have to carry burdens or have to pay costs, that would of course be the wrong way. But we know enough, and we have seen enough good measures in many countries and cities that it can be done in the right way now.
Right. Now, things that the pandemic has done has exacerbated the already existing fault lines, especially when we talk about social safety nets. When we talk about the climate crisis and how much more would governments need to expand these social safety nets, Mr. Sven Hermling, give us a picture of that.
Yeah, I think that's a very important aspect. It's difficult to quantify that, and social safety nets differ from country to country. But there's, for example, some initial experience with strengthening social safety nets in case of big climate-related disasters. So recently, there has been, for example, payouts by an regional insurance mechanism in Senegal and other parts of Africa because those countries were affected. It's important to connect social safety measures with measures which can help poor communities to adapt and to cope with the impacts of climate change. I think definitely we need strong investments there and much more allocations from countries. But we also see how much better it is to prepare and to invest into prevention rather than dealing with the impacts once they've happened.
Right. Professor Hari Srinivas, off from that conversation with Mr. Sven Hermling, continuing it here. Now, how can countries, especially in the developing parts of the world, poorer countries, expand their social safety nets in order to not only deal with this health crisis, but to also make sure that those frequent change in weather patterns, weather crises, they're dealt with?
I think the key point here is to, granted that governments in developing countries have a lesser capacity to set up social safety nets at the national level. And I think what we have to take into account is the inherent resilience systems that are already existing in communities. This not only deals with knowledge, traditional knowledge of climate change impacts and other things that people already know and emphasizing that, but also to look into existing social safety nets, like, for example, microfinance systems or micro-insurance systems, which ordinary people in developing countries can participate and use that not only for crises or for disasters, but also for economic activities. Microfinance can at one point help in the economic recovery, but it can also help during a disaster when you incorporate micro-insurance aspects into microfinance systems. That's just an economic system, but also similarly networks and support systems that already exist within communities has to be emphasized and strengthened by governments rather than set up something top-down, because that's the only thing that will remain when an actual disaster happens at the local level. It's only the local systems that can respond quickly and immediately when a climate crisis happens. So that's why I think developing countries are much better positioned to support and strengthen existing community systems rather than set up something at the national level on a top-down structure. Bottoms-up structures work much better, especially in developing countries.
Professor, now you mentioned here something that is very, very intriguing, and I think it would be of interest to talk about it a little further. When you mention traditional forms of knowledge when dealing with climate change, we don't hear about that enough. Can you give us an example of how that works and where you've seen it work?
Oh, yes. Here in Japan, that kind of traditional knowledge is a very significant factor in understanding how people respond to disasters, especially, for example, tsunamis and typhoons. They know exactly how the typhoon will move, where it will have a less impact than within their communities. And what is the best location to evacuate to, for example, if there is a disaster. These kind of knowledge people already have. If you talk to, for example, one of the things, common practices here is called town watching. You take a map of your local community or your village, you walk around the village, you walk around the town, and try to see which parts of the town or village will have the maximum impact, or where the risks are. And that can be used. That's traditional knowledge. That's where communities know this is the most dangerous place. This is which will be most hard hit. These kind of traditional knowledges have to be emphasized and strengthened and even institutionalized by the governments. And every community you walk through have elderly people who have this kind of knowledge of disasters that have happened in the past. We need to talk to them. We need to record their knowledge. We need to strengthen that and build disaster response, climate response plans around this kind of stories, memories, traditional knowledge, etc.
Right. Mr. Sven Hermling, I'm curious to know what your take on that is to build strategies around anecdotes and stories that work on the basis of traditional forms of knowledge.
Oh, I think I can definitely report also from our own project experience that this is a very important component. For example, some years ago, I visited some care projects in Peru where old potato seeds were reintroduced because they were much less water consuming, and so they were identified to better fit to the future of less water availability in the Andes, and people remembered from their traditions how to work with them. I think what is important is that it's always about understanding the traditional knowledge, but also understanding where its limits are, because we know that things are changing, and one of the particular elements about climate change is that it's not just a continuation of the past, but it can be very disruptive and different from the past. It can be intensifying the events and the impacts that have been learned from the past, but this really depends on the local situation. So traditional knowledge is a very important element that can inform the right measures that need to be taken on local and even national level.
Right. At that point, we have unfortunately come to the end of our show here, but thank you so much, Mr. Sven Hermling, for all your insight, Professor Srinivas, for all your interesting and important insight there. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.